our working group had a conference 2.5 years ago now in Washington at the Wilson Center, International Center for Scholars, which looked at the role of emerging technologies and fostering equitable development in areas such as energy, water, food security, and health. And the book is now out, so if you're at all interested. The conference itself was a collection of activists, scholars, government officials from a dozen different countries, including China, South Africa, Brazil, the US, Zimbabwe. And again, the idea was to see what role technologies could play in fostering equitable development. The paperback book is a mere $35, but I know you want to buy the hardcover, which is $145. Don't ask. And just one other point to make. So Dennis Simon, who Kathy said will be at this very location 2 weeks from now, is the Vice Provost for Strategic and International Affairs at Arizona State University. Dennis has been studying China probably for 30 years now. He's fluent in Mandarin. He holds the keys to the city of Dalian. And I guess he's what they used to call Old China Hand. And he and Sung Sao, as part of my working group, who's at the University of Nottingham, have written a book called China's Emerging Technological Edge. So he's really quite an authority on some of the issues we'll be discussing today. So spread the word on them. So this is our talk, and chose a provocative title, hoping that will provoke some discussion afterwards. And I'll return to this question at the end, but let me first say, so my working group is focusing really on two questions primarily, that sort of govern what we're doing. The first question is the role of industrial policy. As you know, industrial policy has become somehow a four-letter phrase in the United States. You can't talk about it in governing circles. But the idea that the state should be somehow responsible for fostering any kind of industrial growth or economic development is a non-discussable term in Washington currently. Although with the economic meltdown, a little bit of Keynesianism has been resurrected, but very fitfully, I would say. Neil Lane, this is a quote from Neil Lane, who is one of the original architects of the National Nanotechnology Initiative in the year 2000, which fostered U.S. focus on nanotechnology. And he sort of summarizes the problems that he encountered. I'll just point you to the last phrase here. There are people who believe the most important thing government can do is to assure U.S. companies are competitive in global marketplaces, to get out of the way, cut taxes, and reduce regulations. That was a view of the Bush administration. I personally think that this is short-sighted. And so one of the tasks of our working group is to look first at China. We're also now looking at Mexico and Latin American countries and Korea, and to try to get a comparative frame on different types of state policy and how effective they are in driving development outcomes, economic development outcomes. So the role of industrial policy is one concern. And the other concern is the role of international collaboration. And I put a proposal from Carolyn Wagner as part of the conference that I mentioned, and her book, The New Invisible College, where she argues that what she calls the new invisible college are the global networks of scholars, and by inference also business people, who now work across borders. So nanotechnology, being the latest emerging technology to appear, appears at a time when the ease of travel and telecommunications and the internet have made international collaborations extremely easy. And so a second thing that we're looking at, and Ashish will sort of return to this at the last presentation, is to what extent does international collaboration break down national boundaries? And one other point, there's a conflict between the two of these. Industrial policy echoes of nationalist concerns. How can we be first? Will China eat our lunch? Which is the tenor of the discussion in Washington these days. But international collaboration is born of this. And when scientists work together, they often don't have national aspirations. They're concerned with advancing their own research. So the tension between these, I think, is interesting to look at. Well, here's the team. You can see us in the flesh, so I won't dwell on this, but I like these photographs, so I put them on for you. So here's an overview. I'm going to very briefly say a couple words about industrial policy and innovation. I will give a brief summary of what the Chinese government is doing currently, and then for the benefit of those of you who are not nanoscientists in this room, I'll say a word or two about nanotechnology. Galen will then talk about different frameworks that look at innovation and industrial policy. That will move into Shirley's presentation, where she will present the current thinking on China. Should it focus on first-tier innovations or second-tier science and technology? Matt will then take you to our research trip in April, where we will look at the latest form of nanotechnology, which has got emphasis in China, which is bio-nanotechnology. And finally, Ashish will talk about research networks and how internationally collaborative China is. And then I'll return to speculate on some answers to the question we posed at the beginning. So the classic formulation on industrial policy was actually done by Chalmers Johnson at the time that Japan was the rising star. And in his classic book, Many and the Japanese Miracle, he looked at two axes. Whether decision-making in the government was ideological or evidence-based. He didn't use those terms, but that is sort of what underlied his thinking. And evidence-based is a contemporary way to phrase it. And whether whether innovation and government programs, whether economic development was market-driven or state-driven, state planning. And he filled in 3 of the 4 cells of this table. So the U.S. was said to be market rational, that is to say, the market drives it, but with rational decision-making. Japan was plan rational. There was central plan through MIDI in Japan, which helped to guide development, but along empirical grounds, technically anyhow. And the Soviet Union was said to be plan ideological, that is to say, central planning, but driven by communist ideology and therefore ineffective. So 10 years after he produced that, a colleague of mine at the University of Bristol in England, Jeff Henderson, I had a conference on states and development in the Asia-Pacific Rim, and we came up with this reformulation. By that time, it was clear that the U.S. was market ideological. That is to say that what we now call neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus drives everything. And that was sort of the end of the story. The other categories were unclear to us at the time, and particularly China, which was just beginning its trek down what Deng Xiaoping called the capitalist road at the time. So this was sort of our framing of it. And we're going to return to these issues in later presentations. I do want to say that the U.S. does have an industrial policy of sorts. So even though it's not called that, Fred Block at UC Davis has called it a hidden developmental state. And what he argues is that there's a program many of you may not have heard of, which is a small business innovation research program, and its parent program, Small Business Technology Transfer Program, which basically takes money from other agencies involved in research and development and creates a seed grant fund, which is awarded on a competitive basis. So roughly 2.5% of the research budgets of all federal agencies that are involved in research goes into this fund. And the basic idea is that innovation today occurs in networks. And the important thing is to provide funding so firms can connect up with other firms or with researchers. Because firms today, according to this reasoning, don't have Bell Labs anymore. So the key, they don't have labs where huge amounts of research are done on various innovative projects. So instead, the idea is to foster networking. And the role of the government is to step in when it fails. I also want to mention some obvious things. There are other examples besides this program. One is the National Nanotechnology Initiative, launched at the last months of the Clinton administration, which today has brought something like $16.5 billion into science and engineering centers. Our center is sort of crumbs off the table of that effort. They decided 6 or 7 years ago to fund a social science center to look at the societal impacts of that. The current funding is $2.1 billion this year. The national labs, Department of Defense, all of that also reflects an industrial policy, but it's not one that is publicly discussed or debated. So the U.S. does have an industrial policy, it's just not a public policy. Now a couple of words of China. And I put up some pictures here. If you've ever been to China, they're great on models. This is a model of Suzhou where we'll be going. This is Suzhou at night. a complete transformation of the landscape with the building of integrated university greenfield campuses and science and engineering parks. So one obvious point to make is that much of the development in China is driven by us, that is to say, by the trade relations, which are favorable to China and unfavorable to the U.S. So China's foreign reserves currently total something like $3 trillion. And if you look on this side, the U.S. government debt owed to other countries is almost $5 trillion now, and China's share is the largest. So though Japan is close behind, China's $1.2 trillion, Japan roughly $1 trillion. These are fairly recent data, the most recent data that I could get for this. So this money is used productively in various ways. So China's overarching goal is to what they call leapfrog development. Instead of moving up the value chain from making garments to electronics assembly to the next level, and finally leaping on the scene with some new innovative technology, the decision was made, actually going back as far as 1995, to emphasize what is called indigenous innovation. The idea there is that China should become less dependent on technology transfer from foreign firms because that technology is closely guarded, and more reliant on its own scientists and engineers. Critics say this will become doomed like the last great leap forward, which turned out to be a great leap backwards, but I find their efforts, as you'll see, impressive. Their 11th and 12th five-year plans, which will take us through to 2015, see innovation as the centerpiece of their strategy, and the basic idea is to bring foreign firms in, bring Chinese nationals, expats back to China, and structure foreign partnerships in such a way that technology transfer can occur, invest huge amounts of money in science parks and universities, and become a front runner in new technologies. And the plan calls for an emphasis on three areas: healthcare, energy, and technology, and nanotechnology is mentioned specifically. The idea is for China to catch up to the U.S. in terms of the percentage of its gross domestic product, which is invested in research. And China is now probably 1.3, 1.5%. The goal is to make it over 2% by the end of this five-year plan, and eventually 3%, which would equate to what the U.S. is doing. The key to this is the MLP, the Medium and Long-Term Plan for Science and Technology Development, which took effect in 2006. And I'll just say a couple of words about it. It was debated for many years, with scientists debating it within China, expat scientists, the many Chinese scientists who, for example, are on the other side of this campus debating it, and of course members of the Communist Party and the Politburo heavily involved in it. And the scientists favored a peer-reviewed National Science Foundation type approach, but the technocrats in the government essentially prevailed here, and their reasoning was that since China's resources were limited, it should focus on key areas. So there's a little bit of peer-reviewed work, but most of it is directed by government agencies. And the question is, will this work, or will this lead to a lot of wasted money and bad bets? The leading group for science and technology is has a premier Wen Jiabao on it. So science and technology really now is sort of at the highest levels of China as an aspiration, and bureaucratically speaking. Of course, the Communist Party is very important here in directing this. And I won't go through this chart, although one of the contributors, the lead author, Sung Sao, is part of our group, and Fred Simon, Dennis Simon, will be here in 2 weeks. But this was part of the 15-year plan. Maybe 12 or so key areas, a bunch of frontier technologies, I think 13 or 14 engineering mega projects, but importantly 4 science mega projects, of which nanotechnology is one. And I'll just make one comment on that. That nanotechnology was chosen as a science mega project is interesting because it is pure science, and the commercialization of results is a way off. So it's sort of been in an ambiguous position here, and it was probably put front and center in the plan because Bai Chun-li is head of the Chinese Academy of Sciences now and a leading technocrat in China and U.S. trained, so he got a place there. Well, just a couple of things. We'll return to trains in a moment, but part of this trillions of dollars in foreign reserves goes to foreign firms that are building high-speed trains high-speed highway systems, and the landscape is being transformed. And it's crucial because in order for an economy to function effectively, you have to be able to move products and people quickly. Big investment in education. This line here shows PhDs in science and engineering in China. And this is the US and this is India. And so China now produces the US in terms of science and engineering PhDs. Now a lot of those are bad degrees. They're not high quality, but there are a large number of them and some are very high quality. So Tsinghua University, Peking University, Fudan University, and so forth produce. So the numbers are large. Everything with China is the numbers are large. So even if only a small percentage of those are top-tier scientists, that's a large number. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but there are programs designed to bring the best and the brightest back home. And here's a job ad that anyone in this room would love to see. From Shanghai, overseas PhD, under 55, professorship or equivalent position at famous overseas university or research institution. That could include us. Agree to work in China, minimum of 6 months every year, not year-round. Startup salary, research fund 300,000, salary up to 117,000 US dollars, $150,000 housing subsidy. That's pretty attractive. And China's been quite successful. Okay, just a brief statement about nanotechnology. So nanotechnology, as I said, is the latest thing to come on the scene. And every country now, pretty much almost every country has a national nanotechnology initiative. Nanotechnology, by the way, is defined officially as working at a scale of 1 to 100 nanometers. And just by way of comparison, human hair, an average human hair, is roughly 40,000 nanometers wide. So at this level, it's possible to engineer atoms and molecules, to actually move things around and construct them. And the result is that you get all sorts of novel materials, extremely strong, lightweight carbon filaments that can be used in aircraft or cars or mountain bikes or tennis rackets or golf clubs, targeted drug delivery. We'll hear from, I guess, from Matt about that a little bit.
Yes.
What? So lab on a chip, all sorts of things which are supposed to revolutionize and create trillions of dollars in new markets. Water filtration also. So a lot of money has been spent on this. And here's some pictures of the kinds of things that have emerged so far, which aren't exactly world transforming, but it's a start. And I put this up here just because I found it interesting. Nano-electronic mechanical systems have actually been inserted in the wings of moths, which can then be controlled to affect the movement of the wing to kind of make the moth move in a certain direction. So there's a lot of experimentation for, unguided, what do they call, drones and things like that in this technology. Enormous military interest. Okay, so our next topic is Gail, who will address what frameworks can be provided by previous research into innovation and industrial policy.
Thank you. All right, as Rich said, we go through some of the previous theoretical frameworks that have been developed over the past few decades by social scientists who are looking into industrial policy and innovation. So they all kind of start with Schumpeter, who in the late 1930s and early 1940s was writing about how innovation affects an economy. He found that there are 5 different types of innovation up here: new products, new methods of production, new sources of supply, so getting new kinds of materials, exploitation of new markets, going into expanding reach into developing countries, for example, and new ways to organize business. In innovation policy, or innovation studies, usually look at new products and new methods of production. New methods of production being new ways to mass produce products. So those are the first two categories of the primary focus. But new products are almost always lead to economic gain for the country. However, new methods of production often do not, because they lead to laying people off and cost-cutting measures, and that's not always going to give you a clear economic gain. It might give you a productivity boost, but not necessarily an economic gain. There are a few ways that the innovation process usually plays out throughout society. One way to look at it is the evolutionary process, and this is a very simplified way of looking at it. Subsequent research from this has shown that this isn't a linear model as it is shown here. It's kind of more of a scattered model where all these things are happening at once. But the easiest way to think about it is as a linear model where you have product innovation. So the company comes up with a new product, and then other companies imitate it. So we call this first tier innovation and second tier innovation. And then once it's just been imitated for a while and there's no more innovation that can be wrung out of the type of product that it is, then other companies start to innovate the process and how to mass produce it and how to get it cheaper and easier to get into the hands of consumers. So that's one overarching way of looking at the innovation process within a society. Another way is to look at it as a process of punctuated equilibrium. So you have this kind of process, the evolutionary process going on at once, and then someone develops a radical and disruptive breakthrough that completely alters the way that you look at the market in this specific industry. So the light bulb is an example of this. So this changes how people look at what they can do, what kind of products they can produce. And then for a while, the old model exists in society and continues to have some innovation, and then eventually the new model just takes its place and supplants it. Innovation occurs in closed model and an open model as well. So you'll have the closed model is kind of the old-fashioned 1950s, 1960s way of looking at innovation. You have perfect examples of Bell Labs or Xerox. You have a hierarchical organization. It's vertically integrated. All the research and development is done in-house. You don't really look outside. Ideas that are not monetizable are discarded. So if you look at this here, you have a funnel. You have all these new product ideas that are being developed within your research labs. You kind of make some decisions in here about what you should keep, what you should discard, and those things that you don't need, you just kind of don't develop any further. And then you send them into development, and you market them. So a perfect example is Xerox sat on the idea of a graphical operating system for 5 or 6 years until Steve Jobs visited the labs and decided, oh, well, I can steal that. But they weren't doing anything about it because it wasn't part of their business model. It wasn't what they thought they should work on. The other model is an open innovation model. All the firms in a region or a sector are networked together. R&D can come from anywhere. It can be from within the company, it can be outside the company, it can be open source innovation that you can just pull in. And innovation is exchanged between organizations. So what's important here is that you have venture capital to start new firms, you have robust intellectual property laws that you can protect the products that you develop, and then universities are a key institution for that as well. So looking at this model down here, you have a lot of innovation occurring inside the house, you have some outside the house. The firm decides what products they want to monetize, what works. Some of them are outside, some are inside. And they spin off into new firms, those products that do not fit their business model, or they license them to other firms and they monetize what works best for them. So you can look at innovation on several different levels. So there's the national level, which is basically the structure of production, the innovation set up within the country, the policies that are developed, and look at it as all the factors that contribute to this. But then you can also look at it at a regional level, something like Silicon Valley or the Silicon Alley in New York or something like that. Or you can look at a sectoral model of what is the innovation within a specific industry. So I mentioned before about regional innovation, having these regions like Silicon Valley that really develop into powerhouses within an industry or a set of industries. And so there's a whole set of theories that develop around the creative region. So the creative region has a creative economy and a culture of creativity and knowledge exploration, and often also has unique regional specific knowledge. And regional firms want to exploit that. So they do this by having institutions that can facilitate transfer of new ideas, or social capital that allows greater contact between individuals in the firms and people that are creating new products and new innovations. And then these firms go back and they finance creativity and innovation. What's interesting about this is that it's not just innovation that's specific to whatever the firm is looking for. They'll often be funding opera houses or art projects and that kind of thing. And creating that culture of innovation and knowledge exploration is important according to these theories. So one way to look at industrial policy is that it should be facilitated, not directed. If you think back to the Chalmers-Johnson models where you had the plans and the market kinds of models, a facilitated model is going to try to exploit the market so that it can develop the best products that are out there rather than directing a planned model. So the development, I'll just go through a few of the key models which I'll be talking about in the next couple of slides. First one is the development network state. You have a state that tries to encourage international collaboration and innovation. It provides a little bit of funding and just kind of creates the incentives for new innovation. And one of the ways that does this is through innovation centers. Danny Roderick's idea is that you have strategic collaborations between government and the edge technologies, the brand new and exciting things like nanotechnology and that kind of thing. But they don't necessarily pick winning sectors. So in development network state, you might be the country might say, okay, we want to invest in IT, we want to invest in pharmaceutical products or whatever. In the 21st century industrial policy theory, they're not picking any winners. They're just kind of developing relationships with entrepreneurs and firms within these edge technologies. And then the horizontal technology products kind of puts this together. You have state subsidies and then market innovations that lead to new innovations, and the subsidies are more of the strategic collaboration type of subsidy than the development network state type subsidy. And the science state, you are basically just facilitating. The state is just facilitating new innovation and targeting specific industries and opening new doors into ways that the industry can innovate in those specific industries. So you can think about it as a linear approach. You have basic research, R&D leads to product development that goes to market. So this whole process is monetizing an innovation into a product. The industrial policy comes in here, so it's what's called the demand side approach, and I won't go too much into the specifics of that for the sake of time. But if you look at this as a amount of innovation that occurs on the horizontal axis, or I'm sorry, on the vertical axis, when it starts to dip, when the level of activity starts to dip, demand created by the government will pull this along and create more activity so that then you can have a broader amount of innovation that occurs within a country. And this is the approach that the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic and Development, is encouraging developing and developed states to adopt as industrial policy. So looking at some of these theories that we've talked about before, I won't go into them too much here since we kind of already have. But what's important to note is that you have government as this monolithic entity, and then industry is kind of a monolithic entity. Bureaucracy plays a key role in creating relationships between industry and government, and their task is usually to ensure that they know what industry needs, what the best policies to create would be, and then they are autonomous from the politicians and other leaders of the country, and basically just create new regulations and rules that will address the needs of industry. But horizontal technology policy doesn't agree with this. The government is not a unitary actor. And what's important to know is that industry influences politicians, which also influence industry, and politicians and other elected officials also influence bureaucracy. So it's not necessarily as distinct as previous policies, and we'll see a lot of that when we're talking about China. And for that, I will turn it over to Shirley.
So our group has been focused on a lot of readings regarding Chinese technology, innovation, and industrial policy since the last quarter. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we've been reading, along with how it's guided our thinking towards our upcoming fieldwork. So one of the main readings that we've had is this book, Run of the Red Queen by Dan Litznitz and Michael Murphy, in which the book relates China to the Red Queen from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And if you're not quite familiar with the Red Queen or what this run is, I'm going to read you a brief excerpt from the book itself. So there's the Red Queen dragging Alice along. Well, in our country, said Alice, still panting a little, you generally get to somewhere else if you run very fast for a long time, as we've been doing. A slow sort of country, said the Queen. Now here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get to somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. So this notion that China is like the Red Queen in that it's running very, very fast in order to keep up with the cusp of technology without actually advancing the field in any way itself is what the book is about. And furthermore, the authors argue that there's actually nothing wrong with this run of the Red Queen approach for China because it's served them extremely well in the past 2 decades with unprecedented economic growth. And they should continue with this run of the Red Queen, which will be sustain their economic growth into the long-term future. So I'm going to provide a brief description of the book's overall arguments and what it's talking about. So one of the main questions that a lot of people are interested in is, does China need to innovate? So according to the Chinese central government, the answer is a resounding yes, and this may be because of several different reasons. One is common economic belief, as Galen had mentioned, that a country needs to engage in novel innovation in order to have long-term growth. A second reason might be because China is still seen as a world manufacturing plant, and the Chinese government might like to move this perception away from this manufacturing status into a global brand onto themselves. So instead of producing things for Apple, they would like to be seen as something like Apple. The book, however, argues that no, China really does not need to engage in indigenous innovation. They've done extremely well with second-tier or imitation and process innovation. So they've done a lot of manufacturing plant innovations, and they have done extremely successful with this for the past 2 decades. So they don't need to change anything, and engaging in indigenous innovation might actually be detrimental to them in the long term. So the book presents its argument by looking at a case study focusing on the IT sector in China. So this graph here is taken from the book, and it shows the exports of high technology in billions of US dollars from China over time, which is on the x-axis. And so you can easily see here that as we move from 2000 to 2007, there is a tremendous increase in export volume in high technology, with 2007 ending about 350 billion US dollars. And this is all high technology exports, and the IT sector in 2007 took up approximately 95% of all exports. So the IT sector is a very big sector as well as the financial sector for China. So the book looks at the IT sector in 3 different cities: Beijing, where the central government is located; Shanghai, which is a huge business capital where we're going to conduct our fieldwork; and the Pearl River Delta, which encompasses Guangzhou and Shenzhen. So I'm going to provide a little bit more brief description about Shanghai itself in a second, but before I move over there, I'm going to talk about this notion of structured uncertainty, which is something that the book talks about throughout its chapters. And so what it is an agreement to disagree about the goals and methods of policy. So that probably doesn't mean much, I'm just looking at it. So I'm going to use this figure to hopefully demonstrate what it's actually talking about. So what you just need to focus here now is that this picture is mainly surrounding China Mobile, which is a telecommunications business in Beijing. And all of these arrows and other boxes are actors that it interacts with on a national and regional level in order to conduct business. Okay, so just starting off, we're going to start off with the National Development Reform Commission, which is a national bureau that's in charge of rolling out new technologies. So if they're rolling out 3G or maybe 4G, they're in charge of the research, intel, and support for this new technology. And they rely on information provided by several more different actors, including the Beijing municipal government, the Beijing Science, the China Mobile itself, the Beijing Development Reform Commission, and several other national actors. Looking at the Beijing municipal government itself, it relies on 3 more actors, one of which, the Beijing Development Reform Commission, already responds to the first one that we talked about, which was the National Development Reform Commission. The municipal government also relies on the Beijing Science and Technology Committee, as well as the Ministry of Science and Technology Beijing Bureau. add in several more national and regional actors, along with a lot of intertwining relationships, and you finally get a sense of what China Mobile as a company actually has to deal with and have to interact with in order to pass or to do anything as a business. So this entire picture is what really structured uncertainty is about. And you can see that there's no overarching office that's in charge of anyone else. They all respond to and yet govern everyone else in the same picture. So it is believed that structured uncertainty poses a huge hindrance for Chinese indigenous innovation, simply because novel innovation usually is a long-term, high-risk endeavor, and many companies choose not to engage in this in China simply because of this entire network of things that you have to do, and you don't really know when an actor is going to say, I really don't agree with that part of your research, and stop you at any given time. So most companies in China is thought to engage in these short-term, immediate results where they don't necessarily have to deal with so much structured uncertainty. Okay, so moving on to a more in-depth look at Shanghai. As most of you know, it's a high technology leader and a huge business financial sector for China. And since the 1980s, it has received a lot of foreign investment and now is home to many multinational corporations, including Intel, Google, and HP, just to name a few. So along with these foreign investments, Shanghai has also received a lot of knowledge and technology transfer, which has been very good for the city itself. However, the products, the Intel, and a lot of these brands that are associated with these multinational corporations still belong to the foreign enterprises themselves. So Shanghai actually faces many of the similar issues that many other cities in China face as they try to engage in indigenous innovation. So I'm going to talk about a few of the issues that Shanghai faces, and several of these issues apply to other cities in China as well, and these are issues faced with coming up with indigenous innovation itself. So the first one has to deal with talent. So as Rich had shown, the number of college graduates and post-secondary graduates has increased dramatically through time. It's unfortunate because a lot of companies believe that the capabilities of these graduates are limited compared to their foreign-trained counterparts, and many of the companies still would rather hire Western-trained students as opposed to their Chinese-trained counterparts. Secondly, has to deal with the hukou, which is a resident permit for a person to live in a particular city. So although you might get hired and the company's happy to hire you and you're both very happy to be working, a lot of people have to be worried about this hukou if they weren't born in China. So this doesn't really come into play until a couple decides to have kids, at which point their kids aren't allowed to attend Shanghai city schools because they're not an actual resident of Shanghai themselves. And then many employees face the dilemma of actually choosing between where they work and possibly moving back to some place that they don't have work in order to educate their kids. Okay, so Shanghai is home to 3 industrial parks, which is quite a few, and Suzhou, which is about a 40-minute train ride away, is home to another industrial park, this might seem like a good thing. However, it is thought that the distances between these industrial parks themselves and the distance between the industrial parks to surrounding universities is a hindrance to possible collaborations and knowledge transfer. So here we have a table for 2 universities in Shanghai, Jiaotong University and Fudan University, to 2 of the industrial parks. We have Zhangjiang High-Tech Park and Funxian Industrial Zone, and the distances are given in kilometers and in miles, ranging from about 10 close to 40 miles away. So 10 miles, that's from UCSB down to downtown Santa Barbara, which doesn't seem like very long. It takes us maybe 15 minutes. However, in China, when you're relying solely probably on public transportation, that 10 miles could easily turn into a 1-hour trip one way. So they have these nice industrial zones, but they are having troubles accessing academic talent. And lastly, small enterprises in China, they're already facing difficulties in finding sufficient funding, but they also run the risk of getting way too successful, and at that point, the central government decides to, hey, we really like you guys and what you've been doing, so we're going to take you over now. And you are now going to become a state-owned enterprise, and you're going to follow that entire structure that we say China Mobile following, where you follow to that structure and uncertainty. So these are just some of the issues that a lot of cities in China are facing as they engage in indigenous innovation. And lastly, I am going to conclude with some of the reasons why China should stick with second tier innovation or process innovation because it has worked so well for them. So this is a picture of Tsinghua University, which is one of the most prominent universities in China, located in Beijing. It's often compared to MIT in the US. And so universities like Tsinghua has been producing a ton of college graduates and post-secondary graduates in the science and technology sectors. And as mentioned before, it is thought that the way that the academic system works in China and the education system, that many of these graduates, while they're very highly trained, might not be conducive to conducting novel advanced research, but maybe better be suited for second-tier innovation research. And secondly, global production is becoming increasingly fragmented, and as this continues to get increasingly fragmented, China has a lot of advantages in its manufacturing plants compared to their counterparts in offering very efficient ways of producing things for a lot of different companies. So one manufacturing plant can produce a lot of different technologies for different companies because they're so efficient in their manufacturing process. And lastly, as the Chinese become more consumer-based than they already are, a lot of opportunities fall for Chinese companies to just target towards the Chinese market. So when high novel technology products come out, imitators or companies can decide to, well, we're going to take this product and we're going to tweak it so that it fits the Chinese market specifically, and they stand to make a lot of profit just by tweaking things and fitting it for the Chinese market instead of conducting in these long-term, very high-risk endeavors in which to target the world market. So all of these cases are reasons why China is very successful so far and will continue to be successful in the future with this Run of the Red Queen approach, in which they have done very well with second tier and process innovations. And I'm going to hand it over to Matt.
All right, so as Shirley said, this previous quarter, we have been looking heavily into some of this recent way of looking at China, which is second tier innovation and China sustaining amazing growth. Why move away? And of course, in our center, we're very interested in nanotechnology. And one of the striking things for us initially was that whereas IT is a very established technological field, and you can sustain around the Red Queen model, what happens when China tries to engage and enter into a field that is just not established? So clearly this model can't be exported to looking at China and around the Red Queen. And in particular, China's government does realize, and even Chinese people as a whole realize the importance of their market. And by doing second-tier innovation, they must pay royalties to foreign firms, and so they really want to find a way to engage this market with new products and really essentially reap the benefits themselves instead of paying out to others. And so, a quick word on bio-nanotechnology. The reason we specifically chose this was because China does seem to have specific strengths in life sciences, which I'll go into, and also Shanghai and Suzhou in particular is focusing heavily on trying to innovate in the bio-nanotechnology field. And so in order to look at indigenous innovation a bit more in depth, Rich gave a great overview of what it is, but there are some subtleties here that are quite interesting. And one is that indigenous innovation, while on the surface it seems to be particularly calling for new development that's independent of foreign technologies, it does openly mention the co-innovation and re-innovation of foreign technologies. And this has a couple implications. One is that there is some potential confusion within the Chinese scientific community about what they should really be doing. So for example, the kind of benefit and reward structure for a lot of Chinese scientists right now is to re-innovate this foreign technology. So perhaps a lot of the rock star scientists, as they're so-called, are spending some of their time and effort potentially engaging in second-tier innovation. So it's almost like you have these very talented and highly trained scientists, and they're redirecting their efforts into an area you would not find ideal if you want the first-tier innovation. Additionally, there are some foreign technologies are increasingly entering the country in a black box form. There's a lot of tensions forming between Chinese companies and foreign companies because there's all these issues of technology transfer, and are the Chinese, say, reverse engineering things a bit too excessively to help try to leapfrog development? And actually, one of the recent indigenous innovation successes, which is the high-speed train, really kind of highlights some of these tensions. And so the high-speed rail system is being touted as one of the more recent indigenous innovation successes in China. However, a lot of you are probably very aware of this high-profile incident. And so what essentially happened was, in order to gain access to the Chinese market and expand and build these rails, a lot of foreign companies had to form joint ventures with the Chinese companies. And so what they did was, the Chinese companies and foreign companies worked together to build the railway in China. And actually, a lot of the Chinese companies were accused of essentially taking this technology expertise, reverse engineering certain components and parts, changing things a little bit, and then actually going on to compete with these foreign enterprises, not only domestically, but also internationally. And so that was a serious issue, because now you had some Chinese companies that had basically gotten foreign technology trying to, compete in a market where the initial company was from. So to highlight this recent incident, actually, one of the major, it's been said that there is some human error involved with this, but also some experts are saying, frankly, what happened was Hitachi, when they brought in signaling components, basically hid all of the proprietary information, made this black box technologies, and essentially the Chinese operators did not have the proper level of expertise and knowledge about this technology to know whether something was going wrong. So there are quite a few social implications as well as technological implications with the way China's been increasingly interacting with foreign firms. And so just before we talk a bit about bio-nanotechnology, like I mentioned, China has particular strengths in life sciences, and so we did pick this as a case study because we feel like this is an area that China is very well suited perhaps to innovate in. And so already in 2007, China reported 200 government-funded biotech labs, employing over 30,000 people, 500 biotech companies that are not affiliated with governments, employing over 50,000. In January 2010, the United States National Science Foundation ranked China second and published peer-reviewed articles in biomedical sciences. So you may have heard a lot of these issues about Chinese articles, there's a high quality of them, some of them are junk articles. That's not the case. I believe this study was actively focusing on nice peer-reviewed articles. So they're there as far as basic science expertise. And the scientific, there have been significant policies implemented, as Rich discussed, the 1,000 Talents program, the Young 1,000 Talents program, where they're trying to bring back a lot of these foreign Chinese researchers back into the country. And we'll mention this is actually has significant implications for the Chinese research culture as well as technological expertise. And also the most recent 5-year plan in 2011 allocated $308 billion specifically to science and technology development as a whole. And so of that, biotechnology was listed as a major priority because the Chinese government is well aware of their strength in this area. So, while the previous page, which was all the political, it seems like there's expertise is somewhat there. There's a lot of political, kind of strengths for that, for China. And in the sciences, there are also some scientific hurdles that are unique to China in some sense when comparing them to the rest of the world. One is that, this may not be totally unique, is that funding sources value political connections over scientific merit. And there's been some talk of that even in America, but it's more overt there. So as Rich mentioned, there was a debate initially on whether funding for major government projects should be allocated through a peer review process, which is what's typically followed in America, where scientists who are kind of supposedly outside the fold of benefiting from anything that's funded actually debate whether this is a good area to pursue. However, in China, it actually turns out that a lot of the funding is allocated based on connections and political connections. It's that a lot of people who engage in science actually have political positions. So it's essentially like scientists almost in a position to choose to fund themselves. And so recently there's a very high profile science editorial by Xi Yingyang and Rao Yi that actually focused exclusively on this issue and said that in order for China to accelerate and move forward in the sciences, we need to reevaluate our funding process and go back to not only funding projects based on scientific merit, but promoting people based on scientific merit. Another issue is that the Chinese scientific advancement, the basic sciences, focuses on numbers and statistics. And this can kind of get to the heart of maybe why the Chinese PhD is viewed as potentially, lagging a bit behind the rest of the developed world. And as Shirley said, there are actual Chinese universities that are at the top of the game. So there are certain Chinese universities where a graduate from that university is absolutely completely competitive with a graduate of a top American university. However, at their second-tier schools, they have up to 70 to 80% of PhD advisors with a PhD. And this is a significant issue because you have this very sudden drop-off, and I believe Ashish will go into a bit of how and why this could possibly exist. And then additionally, English is kind of viewed as a scientific language now. So this is not as big a hurdle as some other things, because many Chinese students are very, very good at English, especially much more than American students at Mandarin. But this is a hurdle that has to be considered. The other issue, and first of all, I'll say that this seems to be an issue that has been identified and is dramatically changing. But there are some problems such as rampant plagiarism, particularly in Chinese journals that are published in mainland China. And some of the, basically people are saying why and how did this happen, and some of the hypotheses in the report are the traditional Chinese educational experience, where really kind of copying and memorizing has been emphasized in China. And additionally, bonuses and promotions depend on quantity of papers. So, if everybody's publishing so many papers, nobody's reading all of them, they're just counting them. There seems to be really very little kind of barrier to engaging in plagiarism. And then the worst that I think I found is political immunity. This is where a lot of Chinese scientists are actually speaking out too. And what happens is somebody who's a young, unestablished member of a field can publish something, their paper doesn't get in the most prominent journal. And somebody who's much more well established can then copy that paper, republish it, and then claim the idea is their own. And a lot of these people are actually very politically well connected, and so basically the younger scientists can't fight and argue and do anything about it. And so the other issue is this so-called culture of Confucian obedience, which is essentially, that's kind of a phrase I took from an article by a prominent Chinese scientist who's editor of a journal. And basically her argument was that there's this fear of criticism, showing personality or independent thinking. So basically the way to move forward in the society is to kind of not challenge your elders, not try to argue and embarrass somebody, but to kind of fit into the existing framework. And so the reason, once again, that we're going to focus on bio-nanotechnology is that we've identified that this has some potentially transformative applications, such as in particular targeted drug deliveries to be explored all over America as well as China and Europe. There's some scar-free wound healing technology, specifically in Suzhou, that we may be interested in looking into. And there's also this idea of lab-on-a-chip point-of-care diagnosis. So, say a lot of viruses are in the nanoscale region, so you can use nanotechnology to specifically find viruses much cheaper, more easily, and then say identify if someone's actually sick due to certain diseases. And so just for a quick point of reference, that nanobiotechnology does seem to be quite an emerging field both in China and America. I recently found out that there was a Center for Innovation for Nanobiotechnology. I think they switched to nanobio because it makes a nice name point. That was actually established in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so obviously I think after some of these initial presentations, you may think that the framework for innovation and entrepreneurship in China and America should be much different. But America does have these incubators that focus on developing innovation networks and providing access to rare resources. And one of the areas we hope to study or to visit in Suzhou Industrial Park, China, is so-called BioBay, which is the same sort of incubator. So it was opened in June 2007. It's basically has the same kind of concept to bring together a lot of scientists, some industry, and it really does seem to be kind of this almost capitalist entrepreneurship type center. So it would be very interesting, and we hope to see how much of the technology emerging there can truly be called indigenous innovation coming from Chinese scientists versus how much this kind of fits the mold of this imported technology back into the country that's rebranded. And just to say, for now there's about 30 plus companies, and this is an issue we hope to look into, is that they're mostly started by expat Chinese. So that means that at first glance, it does seem that a lot of this is technologies that have been brought back in just due to favorable industrial policy, not necessarily first-tier innovations. And so just to expand on that, these Chinese startups, not only are they started by expat Chinese, the expat Chinese tend to start an American branch first. So they seem to be secondary branches of American companies that potentially are engaging in more of process scale innovation. So mass production, engaging in cheaper labor, in particular with medical companies. I've read a recent article that said it was maybe 10% of the cost to run a study on human subjects for efficacy of a drug in China versus America. And that has a lot to do with not just, these drugs, if they're trying to test them, they are going to test them in a way that's in line with FDA. So this is not some kind of crazy human study, but it has a lot to do with how much they have to pay the subjects, how hard it is to recruit subjects, and how willing people basically are to engage in these types of tests. And then in particular, there's a couple companies that we hope to get in contact with. One is Seronomics, and they're based in Maryland, and they seem to be quite successful. And recently, we're touted on this BioBay main page as a huge success story for this park. So we hope to really see, if it's a huge success story for BioBay, how much was actually done there, or was it just a success story that they got a secondary branch, brought in? And additionally, the same sort of thing is going on with Nanomed Devices. Expat Chinese started a company in New York, moved the offices back to BioBay. And so just a couple pictures and show you, BioBay is actually in Suzhou, which is near Shanghai. That's why Shirley discussed a lot of the Shanghai issues. And it is a very nice, new, modern area. There's been a high level of investment here. And so that is where we're going to go, hopefully track down and try to see if we can get a feel for some of these different political, cultural, ideas and see what an indigenous innovation is really doing for startup companies.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is just give you a quick overview of some bibliometric work we've been doing. We have colleagues in IRG2 at Duke University who have collected for us a large database of what we presume to be everything that has been published in nanotechnology between 1990 and today, or 1990 and 2009, I should say. And so, using bibliometric studies, we want to try and understand what China's emergence has done to international scientific research networks. Right? What does it mean to have a country grow this big, this fast, and target indigenous innovation, but at the same time also target international collaboration? So, quick overview of the data. Right. The first thing you've got to note is that by 2009, China has overtaken the United States. It is the largest publisher in nanotech. So the EU, but that's many countries, of course, put together, adds up to more, but China's bigger than the US. Okay, so it is booming, no doubt. At the same time, if you look at international collaboration rates on papers, that is the percentage of papers in a country that involve, the percentage of papers that involve authors from one country that also involve authors from another country. China's international collaboration rates are basically the lowest amongst all the major scientific powers. So Chinese scientists tend to look inward for collaborators. In addition to that, what you notice is between 2000 and 2005, there is a significant drop, about 18% to 12%. So during this period, international collaboration rates in China dropped by a third. Okay? So this is interesting. Put these two ideas together, right? So you've got a booming country that isn't particularly internationally collaborative, and the question is, what does that do to international collaboration at a global level? And the answer is it slows down dramatically. So we've done some arithmetic work, which I won't trouble you with, but the basic gist of it is that the growth of China, coupled with its low international collaboration rates, means that as China gets really big, international collaboration rates at a global level stop growing. So science just keeps getting more and more collaborative until around 2000, and it stops. And like we saw in China, there is a dip in international collaboration rates, and then it slowly starts to come back. And arithmetically, that is also largely a China effect. So that's what seems to be happening at the global stage. And the question is, what do we make of this? What does this sort of hold for the future? Okay. So what explains China's low and fluctuating international collaboration rates. So one possibility that you might think is size, right? So if a country gets big, if its research community grows and you're looking for the suitable specialists to collaborate on a paper with, you're probably more likely to find them in a big community than in a small community. Therefore, bigger countries should have lower international collaboration rates. As China grows, would make sense that international collaboration may fall. So we start out, I'm going to run through some animated slides here. So this is 1990 to 1995. Each dot on this chart is a country. And what we're measuring on the horizontal axis is research output, which is our proxy for the size of the scientific community. Okay. And what we've got here is the international collaboration rate of the country. And indeed, consistent with that hypothesis, what we find is that bigger countries tend to have lower international collaboration rates. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through the last 20 years and see what happened to China and sort of how China fits there. So starting 1990 to 95, we notice that China has an international collaboration rate that is below trend, right? So given its size, it should be publishing more collaboratively. We go forward 96 to 2000, you notice we're moving outwards because nanotechnology grows. 2001, 2005, we move outwards again, and outwards yet again. Wind it back, and let's ask what happens to Chinese research output, right? Here it's sort of 2/3 of the way up the pack, and then it moves forward, and then it moves forward, second biggest country, now it's the biggest. Okay. But as it moves, the rest of the world, science is getting more collaborative, all these dots keep moving up. China just goes on fairly flat. Okay? So the question is, what do you make of that? Is China really idiosyncratic? So for this, it's useful to look at some previous work. So Song Kao, who's also a collaborator with us, he and Dennis Simon have this book out that basically makes the argument that, look, China, when it started trying to become a scientific power, faced significant hurdles because of its history. So we've got the Cultural Revolution, 1967-77, during which universities are shut down for a decade. Right? The shutdown of the universities results in one decade worth of scientists not being produced. And then going forward, if you then want to try and rapidly increase the size of your scientific community, you've got a significant hurdle. So there have been big human capital constraints. To alleviate them, then of course you have 1,000 talents programs and these government policies to lure people back. Okay? So that's part of the story. Okay? But beyond that, we want to try and take a longer term view of this. Okay? So China is not the first country to try and develop a scientific community and presence. Okay? So we're going back to Europe. So I drawn a guy named Stickway, right? World Systems Theorist, who looked at Europe's emergence as a scientific power or scientific powers in the 19th century, right? And says, look, there's a sort of two-stage process that happens. You can't become internationally collaborative unless you have a comparative advantage in something. And when you first start to engage in science, your comparative advantages, your areas of specialization are not clearly defined. So Stickway says, you got to start with the nationalist phase. And in the nationalist phase, first you democratize science, you need scientists. You need many of them. And so you've got to widen your base. You've got to build scientific institutions. Your educational institutions transform in their mission and become scientific institutions. And then as that happens, they start to develop sort of core competencies, comparative advantages. Once they do that, that's when you're ready for the international stage. You then start to re-emphasize quality over quantity once you've done building enough people. You have some national institutions that achieve global excellence and really become centers for penetration of international science, and inwards and outwards. And that's when you have comparative advantages, that's when you exploit them. So if you take that as the framework, right, and remember we're trying to explain this dip in international collaboration in China, there's at least 7 ways in which China over the last decade resembles Europe during its nationalist scientific phase. So, first, there was an increased emphasis on science in the mission of educational institutions starting in the 1990s. Okay? A very, very, very public series of speeches that instructed universities to see themselves in this way. Then science starts growing around national centers of excellence, so that already by 2006, if you're looking at the institutions in the world that have that are top ranked in terms of publications in nanotechnology, there are a few Chinese institutions that top the global league tables already. There's these distinctive comparative advantages that are developed. This is observed in publication data and matches up quite well with some of the lists that Rich showed you earlier of the kinds of areas the government has been targeting. There is a temporary shift towards domestic collaboration, as we showed you. There's a temporary increase in the use of bilingual journals. You're trying to democratize science, and you've got new members of the scientific community who may not be as comfortable working in English. And so for a while, you've got journals publishing abstracts in Chinese, journals themselves going bilingual, publishing in both languages, new journals, new Chinese journals, but then that's already started to taper off. There are specific geographic areas, so Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong, amongst them, that have really become specific sites for the penetration of international science. And there's a whole lot of other areas in the country that really focus on doing interregional science, okay, which is again something that's predicted during this nationalist phase, right? And there's a voluntary turn to the vernacular language. So if you look at, this is again from our data, if you look at publication rates, the language that papers are published in, here I've got all the major scientific powers that are not necessarily English speaking. Right? And again, what you see is during the same period that we're calling the nationalist phase, Chinese scientists stopped writing in English as much. Okay? Of course, that's all starting to recover. And the reason I say this is voluntary is because there are other people who have been able to get data where you can actually identify who the specific scientists are. And these scientists, it turns out, are publishing in both languages. So they can publish in English, but they're choosing not to for a while. Okay? As you're building a national scientific base. So in all of these ways, our sense of it seems to be is that this is sort of a nationalist phase. It seems to be ending, and we see that with the international collaboration rates, and things are starting to pick back up. And so it appears that China is ready to join the international scientific community in a big way, again, having established comparative advantages. That's our sense of it. But see what the future holds.
Thank you, Ashish. I'll just take a couple minutes to finish up here. So we'll try to eat our lunch. I found a little picture of a panda eating a birthday cake. I thought that doesn't communicate anything.
That's not a very healthy lunch diet.
So Farley Shirley's inspiration, I'll give you a yes and a no. The yes is the official answer of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, which basically says that China is cheating. And the international collaborations that we talked about earlier are seen as a form of technology theft. So if you look at the 2011 report to Congress of the U.S.-China Economic Security Commission, it is really devoted, this is a commission that's been around now for 10 or so years, which is really devoted to following China and looking at its military, economic, and other challenges to the U.S. I've testified before the commission, and what they are really looking for is evidence that China is a threat. And currently, if you read the newspapers, of course, it's been an election season, the Chinese menace is forefront right now. Obama administration is shifting its focus, from Central Asia to the East now. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has issued a report which you can get online. It's worth reading if you're interested in what the American business community thinks about it. But basically, this is just one quote. The MLP, the Medium and Long-Term Plan for High Technology Development, quote, is considered by many international technology companies to be a blueprint for technology theft on a scale the world has never seen before. So the American business community, which is obviously influential in American politics, is very concerned about this. Then what about the opposite? China won't eat our lunch. Well, you've heard this explained quite nicely by Shirley. The whole idea that China really does lack the innovative capacity because of all the reasons we've discussed, because of the reasons that Ashish mentioned also, the loss of a generation of scientists. And so China should continue to specialize in sort of second-tier imitative technologies. The best summary that I know of was given to us personally by C.C. Shen, who is one of China's probably second only behind Bai Chun-li leading nanoscientists. He has the Nanoscience and Technology Center in Beijing. And his quote is, "Whole China is in the rear of the first echelon or the front of the second echelon, ranking 5th or 6th in the world in nanotech." And then he uses the sort of metaphor of more but few. More scientifically indexed papers, but fewer high citation papers. More original ideas, but few original achievements. More patents, but less tech transfer. More purchase advance instruments, few indigenously made. This quote was given to us several years ago. So, he clearly sees China at that point in the second tier. But if we go back to the original chart that I began with, it seems to me now, if we look at China's industrial policy, I would say that China is somewhere between market rational and plan rational. And it really is a moving target. And so I sort of finish with a series of ellipses. If you look at all the curves in China, they all point upward. Now, trends obviously can't continue forever, but barring some unforeseeable development, and there are many fractures in the Chinese system, including a lot of worker unrest and a whole host of problems that we're not focusing on in this talk, things could come to a halt. But if they continue, I think to me it's unquestionable that China will emerge as a top-tier technology and science power, developing their own innovative products over the next decade or so. They've come a long way in the last 20 years, and there's no sign of this abating, and they are investing huge amounts of money. It's only a matter of time, I think, before they draw back a large number of Chinese expat scientists and engineers from campuses such as this, either on a part-time or full-time basis, to seed their laboratories, to change the laboratory culture, which right now has been described to me as cook and look. They work hard, many different experiments, but not really driven by innovative ideas and theory. But in the best laboratories, it's changing. And so I personally am optimistic about the future. And maybe when we come back from BioBay, we'll have some more answers. Thank you very much.